Welcome to Babel, Translating the Middle East, a podcast from the Middle East program at CSIS. Here on Babel, we take you beyond the headlines to take a closer look at what's happening in the Middle East and why it matters. This week on Babel, I speak with Dr. Isabelle Werenfels, a senior fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin. Together, we discuss how Europe's approaches to North Africa and North Africa's approaches to Europe are changing. Then I continue the conversation with Todman and Leah Hickert to discuss how strategic competition is evolving in North Africa and how North African states are building leverage in their negotiations with European governments. To translate some of what's happening in the Middle East, this is Babel. Isabelle Werenfels, welcome to Babel.
Thank you very much for having me, John.
You recently helped write a paper on what were described as NATO's southern neighborhoods. Why should a transatlantic military alliance that's preoccupied with Russia's invasion of Ukraine focus on the Mediterranean?
Well, because what NATO is fighting on its eastern flank is also present in its southern flank. So I think that is a very important reason, because if we look, for instance, at the Sahel, we have a growing Russian presence. We have Russian narratives that are gaining traction in North Africa. We have Wagner, or now Africa Corps, in Libya. And I think it probably came a bit as a shock to the members of the alliance to see how difficult it was to generate solidarity with Ukraine among North African countries in the UN after February 2022. So I think all of these things came together. And then you have Russia drawing on Iranian drones to fight in Ukraine. So I think it's very difficult to separate these arenas. And then, of course, you have the Southern European allies that are direct neighbors of North Africa. And as Pedro Sanchez said at the NATO Summit Public Forum, our well-being, meaning the Europeans or Southern Europeans, depends on that of our neighbors. And I think all of that came together, and I imagine there was a strong push from the Southern European allies to have a look at the southern neighborhoods.
Much of our audience is American, and for an American audience, understanding what should be a NATO role, what should be an EU role, what should be a national role, what should be a multilateral role, and what venue is a little bit complicated. What's the breakdown in what, in your mind, should be NATO's approach to North Africa, or to the Mediterranean basin, and the EU's approach to the Mediterranean basin?
There really should be a division of labor very clearly, as you insinuate, and the EU is the actor who is best at all of the questions of development aid, the economic questions, whether they're good at that or not, we can discuss, but this is their turf. When it comes to security, I think NATO has a value added. And if we just take one example, most North African armies really noticed how well the Ukrainians did initially in February 22, thanks to NATO training. So these countries are very keen on that, and it is a way to build ties and in a way bring them closer to the alliance, which is the ultimate goal. And I think at the same time, it would be naive to think that these countries will decide between NATO, the alliance, Western countries, whatever we want to call it, and the strategic competitors. But there are areas where NATO has things to offer that the EU cannot offer. And often, by the way, when it comes to heavy lifting, even in domains such as resilience, disaster control, etc., we shouldn't forget that within NATO, we have the US, and at the same time, there is Turkey. And I think that is also a very important signal to some of the southern partners.
So let me ask about the strategic competitors, because, of course, Algeria has a long history of relationships with both Russia and with China. Egypt has been deepening its relationships with both Russia and China. As you've watched the Ukraine war unfold, What kinds of attitudes have you seen in North Africa toward solidarity with NATO about Russian moves? And to what extent is there a sense that Russia is a useful player, partly for its role in regional affairs, partly for its role pushing back Western European demands for human rights democratization and those kinds of things? You spent a lot of time thinking about Tunisia, and there certainly is a sense that China is a welcome alternative to Western pressure on democratization. So, as you think about solidarity, how do you think North African countries think about the prospect of solidarity with NATO countries, Western countries?
Well, I think there's a huge ambivalence with regard to Russia and to different degrees. You mentioned Algeria, that has a very long history cooperating with Russia. And since 2022, Algeria has in the UN resolutions largely, but not completely, aligned with Russia. But what is more interesting is that Algeria saw that its close relations with Russia do not necessarily pay off in its immediate neighborhood, meaning the Sahel. Algeria had good ties with Mali, decent ones with Niger. And since the coups in those two countries, it has been quite turbulent. Relations with Mali have gone sour, despite the fact that the new military junta in Mali is close to Russia, very close to Russia. And then Algeria does not like having private militaries in neighboring countries. And its ambassador said that at the UN just a few days ago. And of course, this is with regard to Wagner/Africa Corps. So I think this is one thing which has made them ambivalent. But then at the same time, there is this sense that it's an alternative, that Russia, together with China, offers an alternative global order. And what China, more so than Russia, really has to offer is a more just, more equitable global order that takes into account what the countries in the global south need and want. So I think that's where the ambivalence is. And then we also have differences between governments and populations, and we have differences between different countries. A country like Morocco has aligned much more with the Western countries on Ukraine. It has relations with Israel. It is fiercely anti-Iran. Whereas you mentioned Tunisia. In Tunisia, we have an interesting situation. We have a military that is rather pro-Western because most of its equipment, most of its corporations are with the US, and that's going very well. They have good NATO ties. So we have that, but we have a president who has a totally different discourse, who has traveled to Iran, who is pro-Russian, who's been to China, and who is more or less courting these states or they're courting him. But I would argue that large parts of the political elite are still in a different mode. And that's another dimension, how strongly dependent, not just Tunisia, all of these countries are, for trade reasons, of Europe. And I think that is something that we still see, even if they have diversified, even if Algeria is being courted because of its gas, Europe is a really important partner, and it has pipelines that go to Europe. We cannot forget these dependencies. At the same time, the cooperation paradigm between Europe and North Africa has changed fundamentally in the past years. And that's what Europe is trying to come to terms with, and so far hasn't managed.
So let's talk about that. When you and I first met more than 20 years ago, everybody was talking about the Barcelona process, the Euro-Mediterranean partnership. What happened to those ideas that were so much in the air in the early 2000s? What do you think went right and wrong, and what needs to be done differently going forward?
That's a huge question. And I think the framework at the time was, there were different baskets. There was the political track, there was the economic track, and then there was the civil society track. And there was already a contradiction at the time between strengthening civil societies and closely cooperating with authoritarian regimes But I think that was not the essential problem. The problem was that somehow reforms in those countries didn't really work or not work enough. The idea was that there should be a ring of prosperity around the Mediterranean. And the reforms didn't come in the way that Europeans had hoped for. And the relationships just didn't deepen the way Europeans had hoped for. And I think one reason was at the time, Europeans were very much in a donor-recipient mode. And they were not ready to make concessions on issues that were very important to those countries. In trade, if you look at tomatoes from Morocco or olive oil from Tunisia, Europeans were not ready to really open their markets. And as far as visas was concerned, that was a frustration for the Southern partners because obviously Europeans for domestic reasons couldn't grant visa freedom, freedom of movement. So there was a lot of disappointment on the part of the Southern partners and a lack of will to really engage in those reforms the Europeans wanted, and certainly not democratic reforms. I mean, they saw no reason to engage in those prior to 2011, to the so-called Arab Spring. And I think what has changed in the past years is that the North African countries now want to call the terms of trade. And Europe is still struggling how to deal with stronger sovereignty reflexes, growing leverage, and negotiation power. The North African countries have. And there's lots of reasons, but the main one is the issue of migration. And the second one is exports of oil and gas or dependency on oil and gas. What also matters, but much less, is phosphate and other minerals. So I think that has given these countries a lot more negotiating power. And there is another factor which has put them in a stronger position. That's the instability in the Sahel, which has made stability in North Africa even more important, and the growing presence of strategic competitors. And a country like Morocco has become very aware of the fact that it has important trade corridors between Europe and sub-Saharan Africa. And that connectivity has become a huge issue, highways, pipelines, ports, and that it's being courted by many actors. So I think we see a lot of leverage, and at the same time, the Europeans are not united among each other in how to deal with these countries. And these countries are excellent. They have learned how to play European countries one against another.
So let me pick up on 2 points that you just raised. One is you said that these North African states have a lot more leverage, and they're using the leverage more effectively. To what extent has the 2011 Arab Spring changed European perceptions, European zeal to promote democratization? Is there a sense at all on the European side that maybe it wasn't worth it to invest so much in democratization because it didn't yield much? Or was there some other impact of the Arab uprisings of 2011 that sort of reframed the way Europe thinks about what's happening in North Africa?
Yeah, I think there were a number of things that reframed that. After 2011, there was general euphoria, absolutely. And there was a conviction that democracy was really coming and that we would see linear processes. And disappointment already began in 2013, I think, with Egypt. And at the same time, European countries, to different degrees, were very wary of growing strength or impact of Islamist parties. And then after the 2013 Sisi coup, the atmosphere already changed a little bit. And I think for many European countries, 2015 was another really important point when we had the so-called migration crisis. And then after that, democratization was off the agenda. The one and only concern was, how can we keep migrants out for domestic reasons? Because if we don't keep them out, we will have right-wing parties getting stronger and right-wing discourses and narratives dominating our domestic politics. So we had a change and we had a disillusionment, because if you look at a country like Tunisia, enormous funds were invested from the European perspective. And then there was stagnation, and there was a sense that many important reforms didn't take place, not just political, but also economic. And then from 2021, we had a new president becoming increasingly authoritarian. So I think disillusionment is almost total. What I didn't mention, but I think it played less of a role in Europe than migration, is, of course, also terrorist attacks that happened after 9/11 and jihadism coming from North Africa. You know, the Islamic State was in the Middle East, but there was an amalgamization also of the entire region, and it came across again to many as a threat. And then again, right-wing politicians played on that, and that changed the whole cooperation paradigm from the European side. While from the other side, there was self-confidence growing, leverage growing, and negotiating power.
And of course, as you mentioned, Europe is not a single body. There are different countries with a whole set of different perspectives. Are there different blocs in Europe? Or are there groups of countries that think about things in different ways? And how would you disaggregate them to understand where Europe's coming from?
If you look to democratization, you have always had a Northern European bloc and a Southern European bloc. And it was the Northern Europeans where democracy, human rights, etc., were very dominant in the discourses, maybe a little less in the policies. Countries such as Spain, France, Italy were always very pragmatic when it came to democracy. I mean, these were their direct neighbors. They wanted to cooperate with them. They have close trade relations. So in those countries, I would argue human rights, democracy, governance discourses played a smaller role. So we had these blocks with regard to democracy. And then, interestingly, you had Eastern Europe with increasingly authoritarian tendencies or currents. I mean, if you look at the Hungarian president, or what was at a certain time the case in Poland, where there were sympathies for authoritarian leaders. And then you have uniting issues such as migration. And I think Egypt is a country where most European countries will have the same policy. I mean, what you hear all over Europe is Egypt is too big to fail. Egypt is geopolitically crucial because of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I think on Egypt, there's no disagreement. But when we move toward the Maghreb, we really have huge disagreements. If we look at Libya, during the times of huge violence, where General Haftar, the Russian-backed general who commands Eastern Libya, was moving toward Western Libya, we had France supporting him, while other Europeans were very much with the UN-backed government in the capital in Western Libya. So you had these dynamics and really almost hostilities. Italy had a different position from France. Germany was very much trying to mediate. These are the dynamics, and it's very easy to create divisions among European countries when it comes to North Africa.
Let me take you back to Libya. During the Libyan civil war, the Obama administration talked about leading from behind. Has the way that European countries and the United States engaged in Libya changed the way that you think that they're likely to engage in security issues in North Africa? And how does Libya shape how the United States and European countries think about bilateral versus multilateral engagement in regional security issues?
I think it has certainly lowered the appetite for intervention. I mean, that is absolutely clear, because the outcome is not what any of the countries engaged in Libya in 2011 were wishing for. And I think Libya has shown how difficult it is to multilaterally engage in the security domain with a country that is so divided, because you will always have different positions of individual actors. I mean, again, you have the direct neighbors such as Italy and to a certain extent France. You have others that are further away and then take on different positions in Europe. But Libya has also shown the Europeans that if you have a power vacuum, you will have strategic competitors moving in there. And this is what has happened with Russia. On the whole question of whether Europeans are still enthusiastic for democratization, I think anything that could imply destabilization is something Europeans are extremely wary of. And of course, Libya plays a role in this. And countries like Algeria are profiting from this because they are increasingly considered as an anchor of stability. So regimes in those countries are being supported. And Morocco, of course, I think is at the moment, in a way, the big winner in the region. And also Egypt has profited enormously from the instability in the larger neighborhood.
There's a long European history of colonial ties to the Mediterranean basin. France played a dominant role. UK, of course, also played a role. And of course, there was the Italian colonial presence in Libya. How does that legacy shape the way Europe continues to engage with the Mediterranean basin, the way the Mediterranean basin continues to engage with Europe? Do you sense that even the non-colonial powers in Europe think about the Levant, which was largely British, differently than it thinks about the Maghreb, which was largely French?
I think the colonial legacies are interestingly becoming much more of a burden these days than they were 10 years, 20 years, 30 years ago. And I think France is sensing this very, very much. If we look at how after 2011, when France to the last minute, by the way, supported the dictator in Tunisia, France has become unpopular in Tunisia and among the Tunisian class. And I think in Algeria, it was always very ambivalent. But also Morocco has begun to move away from France. So I think that these colonial legacies play out a lot in hostilities or in very strong post-colonial discourses these days, and discourses of neocolonialism and what I said before in sovereignty reflexes. So if we look from the European side, it has become much more difficult to come with advice or even what Europeans do not consider as patronizing suggestions, but will be considered as patronizing or neocolonial from the other side. And everything that has to do with speaking about political systems in these countries is rejected as being neocolonial. And there it doesn't matter which country it comes from. Of course, France is in the most difficult position, Italy to a certain extent in Libya. At the same time, one cannot deny the extremely close ties in the social fabric, in the language, in where young people from the Maghreb want to go and study. Libyans like to go to Italy. All the Francophone Maghrebis basically want to go to France. So still, it's changing a little bit, but it's very complex, very troubled, and I would argue it's getting more difficult. And this is where there is also a possibility to come in with new discourses of global order for actors such as China that claims to offer a different order, which is more based on justice, which doesn't have the colonial baggage, etc.
What do you think that means for U.S. and European cooperation in the Middle East? Is the United States seen as part of that hegemonic project that's disadvantaged and gets lumped in with Europe? Are there ways the United States can untie the colonial legacy because of the long American history of anti-colonialism? How should it play out from a U.S. and European government perspective?
I think the US has a big advantage, theoretically. At the moment, practically it doesn't because of the war in Gaza. I think that is changing the way North Africans are looking at the US. But if we move back to before 7 October, I would argue that in a country like Tunisia, the US was able to criticize more without causing a public outcry than many of the European countries. With Morocco, we know that ties are very good and very close and getting closer all the time, which also, of course, has to do with the normalization with Israel and the whole so-called Trump deal, which has been upheld by the Biden administration. So it's very difficult to say where it's going now with anti-US sentiment. And then we have another thing. I think Maghrebis are quite divided over what administration they wish to see. I think the Moroccans would have the smallest problem with the Trump administration, probably Egypt also, because Morocco has been close or profiting from the Trump administration. Trump made very positive remarks about Sisi. He will remember that. So we would see different reactions to different US administrations. But I do think if we discount the current situation, the US can approach these countries in a different way because it doesn't have the colonial legacy.
Isabelle Werenfels, thank you very much for joining us on Babel.
Thank you very much for having me.
Dr. Werenfels argued that Middle Eastern states have been acting as if they have more leverage with European states now than a decade ago. Are they acting that way with the United States too?
One thing that's interesting to start with is the fact that everybody assumes the United States can just get the Israelis to do exactly what it wants. And we've seen the United States has not been getting exactly what it wants from Israel. On the other hand, it does feel like there has been a bit of a push and pull with the United Arab Emirates. Certainly some arms sales have been held up because of the Emirates' ties with China. On the other hand, some technology investments have been made as the Emirates pulls away from China. So it feels in part like there's more jostling back and forth than one might have thought in the past. But I got the sense from my conversation with her that she felt it was newer and more disturbing. And I think from a U.S. perspective, there's always been an assumption that there's going to be give and take, and success in many cases is going to be partial.
In lots of ways, these countries are a lot further away from the United States. So, of course, they have more leverage over Europe than they do over the US. But some of them are still, at least on paper, very important partners to the US. Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt are all major non-NATO allies. And so that implies a very close relationship with the United States. And then I'm surprised that some of them have been able to get away with as much, perhaps without the US really stepping in. When you think about Tunisia, Kais Saied's power grab has not been described as a coup or recognized as a coup by the US. After these roundups of civil society actors and journalists and political opponents being imprisoned, still it has maintained this ally status. So in some ways, I think they do have some leverage over the US in that they can get away with quite a lot without really facing severe consequences. As Dr. Werenfels said as well, Russia and China are starting to play a bigger role in North Africa, and some of these countries are getting quite good at using their potential to grow ties with US adversaries as a way to exert some kind of leverage over the US. Again, going back to Tunisia, that's something that we've seen Kais Saied do quite a lot. And yet, as far as I'm aware, with the recent appropriations bills, Tunisia isn't facing really severe aid cuts, despite cozying up in some ways to Russia, to Iran, and to China.
It may be in part because the United States really does have fully global relationships. There's not sort of that same sense of the near or broad. And so for European countries that are used to being the first among equals in many ways in their relationships with these countries with higher stakes, they're feeling more of a change. For the United States, which really has bilateral relations with, 180 countries in the world, there's always a sense that you never get everything you want. You have a lot of tools, but you have to do a fair amount of cajoling and taking less than you might want. Maybe it's just with so many different relationships, it's less off-putting because we never get everything we want from anybody.
Dr. Werenfels explained that NATO and the EU have distinct yet complementary skill sets, with the former focused on aid and development and the latter focused on security issues. But there are other differences in these two groupings as well. How do those differences manifest?
On one hand, I think structurally, they're quite different organizations. NATO is an alliance, and the EU is and acts more like a confederation. So that means the EU in itself can have its own foreign policy. And we've seen that when it comes to Gaza, for example. The former EU policy chief, Josep Borrell, he made quite a few quite strong statements on Gaza, which several EU member countries, I think, would certainly not make themselves. Whereas for NATO, it's much more challenging because it doesn't have its own foreign policy as an organization. Members-wise, obviously, there are differences as well. Having the US, Canada, the UK, Turkey in NATO, which aren't in the EU, means that NATO has some more clout, some more economic power behind it, but also obviously military power. But that also sort of constrains it in some ways as well. I think the fact that the United States and the UK as well are involved in NATO means that in times like the current moment, where the US is really being criticized across the MENA region for its role in Gaza, I think that does have a knock-on effect to NATO, because a lot of people view the US and NATO as sort of one and the same. Certainly NATO was very unpopular for its role in Libya as well, and the sort of failed intervention there. So I think there's a way in which the EU can present itself as a kind of new player, despite the colonial past of European powers that you were talking about, Jon. I do think to some degree the EU is trying to carve out a kind of new role for itself, which is harder for NATO given its ties to the US and others.
But it also seems to me that it's the ties to the US that gives NATO both a clearer direction than the EU. I mean, the EU is explicitly a consensus-driven organization. NATO, in many cases, is either directly or indirectly commanded by Americans who set the agenda and line folks up and can be purposive and directive in a way that the EU sometimes has a hard time mustering. Sometimes that's a liability, but my sense is certainly on the military side, militaries are looking for capabilities, and my understanding is that the perception is U.S. capabilities, the ability to interoperate with American forces, is very attractive to militaries that are looking for capacity and also looking for American backing. It does seem to me that the overwhelming role of the U.S. in NATO gives NATO a certain traction in the Middle East that the EU doesn't necessarily have. You know, on the aid front, USAID has a checkered record. I'm not sure if the Europeans have a much better reputation, but it seems to me the Western countries have been working for 75 years on this issue set. If you looked at their expectations in 1950 for what the region would look like and what they'd be able to achieve and how similar they would be able to make the Middle East look like Western countries, I think for the most part, you would say they've not been nearly as successful as they had hoped.
Is the threat of mass migration the principal and enduring issue between European and North African governments? And if so, how do you expect that issue to unfold?
So I think it's certainly going to be an enduring issue. If you look at demographic projections, then we expect a huge population growth in sub-Saharan Africa and in the MENA region, while also a declining population in Europe. So I think it is natural that there would be a push and a pull for migration across the Mediterranean. From the North African states' perspective, I think this is a very helpful tool for them. It's only really an effective tool of leverage so long as they have the ability to turn on and off the tap, though. If they want to try to get a major aid package or some kind of political concession from European countries, they have to prove that they have the ability to clamp down on migration in exchange for those things. And so I think there is a scenario in which the wave of migration gets so great that they actually lose that leverage because there's really nothing they can do to stop it. On the other hand, though, you could see a future scenario in which European countries need more people, and it becomes much less politically divisive in Europe to have an inflow of migrants because they need people to be nurses and to work in agriculture and to work in construction and whatever it might be. And so I don't think we should assume that the politics will necessarily remain the same. So I don't know that it will remain the principal stress point between them, but I think it will be an enduring one.
The other piece of this, of course, is that the nature of migration is changing. Partly as you've had generations with roots in North Africa who've grown up in Europe, you have more people going back and forth. I think in many ways you have the growth of a cosmopolitan class with feet in both places. And that may be part of why North African states are able to push back more effectively, because they understand Western societies. They, in many cases, have a foot in Western societies at the same time that they have a foot back home, that they are able to build business ties that don't necessarily have to be mediated by governments. I mean, there's a change in the nature of human capital in North Africa and an interweaving of communities between North African countries and European countries that used to be occupied principally by expatriate Europeans with a foot in North Africa. And it seems to me it has an increasingly active role played by North Africans with a foot in Europe, but are keenly interested in advancing North African interests.
Thank you for joining me, Jon and Will.
Thanks, Leah.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Babel. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find more analysis on this topic linked in the show notes on the CSIS website, and you can find us on Twitter at CSIS Mideast.